The river remembers the sea. That's what Wallace Greer's father used to say, standing at the stern of the shrimp boat in the hour before the Altamaha River found the sound, watching the water change color where the fresh water lost its argument with the tide. He said the river never forgot where it was going, that even in drought years, when the flow dropped to nothing you could wade across, the river was still pulling toward the sea, still carrying whatever the land had given it, still arriving at the same mouth it had always used. Wallace was 74 years old. He had been reading that mouth his whole life. He'd worked the river as a shrimper from the time he was 19. Learning alongside his father in the flat-bottom boats, they ran out of Darien, Georgia, dragging nets in the dark hours before the heat came on. His father had shrimped this section of the Altamaha since 1948, and his logs, 31 seasons of them, recording the tides, the hauls, the behavior of the river mouth in every weather. We're in a tin box in the wheelhouse of Wallace's skiff, the same wheelhouse where Wallace kept his own logs going back to 1980. He had started as a year he took over the passenger service. His father had handed him the tin box and said, "These aren't stories. They're how you know where you are." Wallace still ran the skiff across the river mouth 6 days a week, ferrying people between the mainland dock and the island side, the way he had run it for 31 years. The boat was called Altamaha. His father had named his first shrimp boat the same. Some things didn't need explaining. The river mouth was not a fixed thing. It never had been, and Wallace had never expected it to be. The bar at the inlet shifted with the seasons, building on the north side in late summer, pulling back in winter when the river ran higher, returning in the warm months in roughly the same configuration it had always used, with a main transit channel on the south side that his father had marked in pencil on the back page of the 1961 log, and that Wallace had been checking against every season since. It was always approximately right. The river mouth used the same address, the way a family uses the same house across generations. The details changed what the position held, which was why, in the autumn of his 71st year, Wallace started writing things down that he hadn't thought to write before. The first thing he noticed was the mullet. The mullet run was the most reliable event in Wallace's working calendar. Every September, usually within the same 2-week window, the finger mullet moved from the river into the sound and numbers that changed the color of the water, a rolling, flickering mass migration that his father had been logging since 1948 and that Wallace had been logging since 1980. You could set a watch by it. His father's log showed the run arriving between the 10th and 24th of September across 31 seasons, with only 2 exceptions, both in years of significant drought, when the river's reduced flow pushed the timing back by a week. This September, the run arrived on the 28th of August, 12 days early. Wallace wrote it down. He noted the date, the estimated size of the run, the water conditions. He went back through his father's logs and his own, 54 years of September mullet runs, and the run had never arrived in August. Not once. He did not immediately know what it meant. He knew mullet timed their migration to water temperature and flow dynamics. They moved when the river's push and the tidal pull reached a particular balance that triggered the run. If that balance had shifted earlier in the season, either the river was running differently or the tidal exchange at the mouth was different, or both. He ran the crossing the next morning in the same flat light he had always run it in, watching the mullet moving through the river mouth. He had watched the mullet run for 54 years. He knew what it looked like and what it felt like when something was wrong with it, a quality of urgency in the movement. The fish pushing harder than they should have needed to. He wrote that down too. The following September, the run arrived on the 21st of August, 7 days earlier than the year before. He pulled out the tin box and spread his father's logs on the wheelhouse chart table beside his own and looked at them for a long time. The bar was the second thing. Wallace ran his soundings the way he always had, dragging the lead line over the northern shoal on the first day of each month, the same stations his father had marked in the back of the 1961 log, recording the depth at each point and comparing it to the previous month. It was a kind of record-keeping that looked like habit from the outside and was actually navigation. What he saw in the third year of early mullet runs was that the northern bar was extending itself east earlier than it should have been, not in a way that disrupted his crossing. The south channel was still clear, but the bar was building into the eastern margin of the transit corridor in September and holding there into November, when historically it would have pulled back with the autumn river rise. His father's log showed the bar retreating by October, and every year he had recorded, this bar was not retreating. It was holding east and beginning to extend south. He stood at the north edge of the bar for a long time on a low-tide afternoon, looking at how it was sitting in the water. His father had taught him that a bar told you its own history if you knew how to read it. The way the sand was sorted by the current that moved it, the direction of the small ripples on its surface, the angle of its leading edge. This bar's leading edge was running southeast. That wasn't where it should have been pointing. He measured it carefully. He wrote it down. He did not say anything to anyone yet. He had a theory. But a theory wasn't the same as evidence, and the water didn't reward guessing any more than it rewarded impatience. His theory was that the tidal prism at the mouth was changing. The volume of water that moved in and out of the river mouth with each tide determined how the bar built and where it migrated. If something had altered the tidal exchange, reduced it, redirected it, the bar would respond before anything else did. The bar was always the first thing to know. He thought about what might have changed, and that was when he remembered the announcement. The Georgia Transportation Authority had approved a causeway connecting a barrier island to the mainland the previous winter. The causeway would cross the tidal river mouth on a fixed-span bridge over the main channel, with a landfill approach road built across the northern shoal zone on either side. Wallace had read the announcement in the county paper and not thought much about it. The crossing was to the south of where he ran his skiff. The authority had done its permits. The project had been through review. He hadn't thought to connect it to the mullet. But sitting now with 3 years of early run data and a bar that was migrating east and south in a pattern he had never seen, he pulled out a county map and looked at the northern shoal zone where the landfill approach road was being built. The approach road was going in at the northern shoal, the same shoal that had been building east, the same zone where his father, in September 1962, had written a single entry that Wallace had read 100 times without knowing why it mattered. Bar moved east again after the Hendricks dock went on the north shore. South channel narrowed by half. Thought it would recover. Watching. And then, the following March, channel recovered. Bar pulled back to normal. Hendricks dock eventually abandoned. Undermined. River corrected itself. His father had watched a private dock installation on the northern shore trigger a bar migration in 1962. The dock had been small. The river had corrected itself in less than a season once the obstruction was understood. The Causeway approach road was not a dock. It was 300 yards of landfill, engineered to hold permanently. He made a phone call. The Georgia Transportation Authority's public review period was still open. Wallace had 2 weeks. He organized a tin box in his own logs the way his father had taught him, chronologically, without editorial comment, letting the data make its own argument. He made a chart, hand-drawn on graph paper, showing mullet run timing from 1948 to the present. The shift was visible even to a person who had never looked at a river. A consistent band of late September dates across 54 years, and then 3 consecutive years of earlier and earlier arrival. He brought the tin box and the chart to the authorities' review meeting in Brunswick on a Thursday morning in October. The room held 40 people. Most of them were in favor of the project, which was understandable. The causeway had real economic significance for the county, and the resort development had been promising jobs for 3 years. Wallace was not there to argue against the project. He was there to argue about where the landfill approach went. The authority's lead engineer was a man named Bridges. He was professional and genuinely attentive, and he listened to Wallace's full presentation without interrupting. When Wallace finished, Bridges acknowledged that the mullet timing data was unusual. He said the authority's hydraulic model, the inlet, showed the landfill approach's effect on tidal prism to be within acceptable parameters, a reduction of less than 3% in the monthly average tidal exchange volume. He said that bar migration was a natural and expected phenomenon in tidal inlet systems, and that the approach road's position on the existing northern shoal was chosen specifically because the shoal already represented a low-velocity zone with minimal contribution to the inlet's tidal dynamics. Wallace asked how many years of tidal data the hydraulic model used. Bridges said 22 months. Wallace nodded. He looked down at his father's 1962 entry for a moment. Then he looked up. He said, the bar that migrated in 1962 started on the northern shoal, moved east in the first season. south into the channel in the second. It took the river 8 months to correct itself after the obstruction was removed. Bridges said the landfill was engineered to different specifications than a private dock installation. The comparison was not directly applicable. He was probably right about the specifications. He was wrong about the comparison. Wallace drove home along the coast road with the tin box on the passenger seat and the window down. Construction began in March. Wallace watched it from the water when his ferry route brought him near enough to see. The landfill approach on the northern side went in over 6 weeks, layered and compacted, pushing out from the existing bank into the shoal zone. He noted it in his log with the same brevity he used for everything. Landfill approach, north shore, east section complete, bar condition, unchanged. He continued his monthly soundings. In May, a month after the landfill was finished, he noticed the watercolor had changed at the margin of the approach road. A faint turbidity was working its way south in the construction zone on the incoming tide. He logged it. He watched it for 2 weeks. Then it cleared, and he moved on. In June, the bar showed the first eastward extension of the season. This was not unusual. The bar built east in early summer every year. What was different was that it was already at the position where it had been in previous Septembers, 2.5 months ahead of schedule. He wrote it down. In July, the mullet scouts appeared. This was the advance movement. Small groups of mullet working the river mouth before the main run, probing the conditions. His father had noted in the logs going back to the 1950s, always arriving in late August. Wallace logged their position on the 15th of July. He told himself he might be wrong about the cause. The mullet had been early for 3 years before the landfill went in. Maybe the timing shift had nothing to do with the northern shoal. Maybe it was a larger pattern, a regional change in coastal water temperature, a shift in the river's seasonal flow schedule, any number of things that had nothing to do with 300 yards of compacted fill on the northern margin of the inlet. He was a skiff operator, not a hydrologist. He had good records, but records weren't models, and models were what the authority trusted. He ran his route and watched the bar and wrote in his log and waited. The main mullet run arrived on the 9th of August. He sat with that for the rest of the afternoon before he wrote it down. He had not been certain the bar migration was connected to the landfill. He was still not certain. But the run arriving in the first week of August, when his father's records showed it had never arrived before the 10th of September in more than half a century, that was not a regional pattern. That was not a warm water year. That was the inlet telling him something about how the water was moving through it. And the inlet had been trying to say it for 4 years now. He picked up the pen. He wrote it down. The south channel narrowed in September. Not dramatically. Not enough to close it to traffic. But his depth readings at the mid-channel station, the one his father had marked in 1961, the one Wallace had been recording every month for 44 years, showed a decrease of 8 inches from the previous September. 8 inches was not an emergency. 8 inches, coming after 3 years of early mullet runs and a bar migration that was running 2 months ahead of its historical schedule, was a pattern. He called the county harbor master. Then he called the state's coastal resources office. Then he contacted a coastal geomorphologist at the University of Georgia named Dr. Vasquez, who had been doing research on Georgia Barrier Island inlet systems, and whose name he had found in a county extension bulletin from the previous year. Dr. Vasquez came out the following week. She brought equipment, a portable acoustic Doppler current profiler, which measured the velocity and direction of water movement through the inlet at multiple depths simultaneously. She ran surveys at 4 stations across the inlet, including 2 at the margin of the landfill approach. What she found was consistent with what Wallace had been recording from the surface, but provided a mechanism he had not been able to see from a skiff. The landfill approach had reduced the low-velocity buffer zone on the northern side of the inlet. That buffer had been absorbing a portion of the tidal energy that moved through the inlet on each flood tide. With the buffer reduced, the tidal flow was concentrating in a narrower corridor, and concentrating tidal flow meant the bar had more energy to move, and was moving it in a predictable direction, east along the shoal, then south when it met the channel. The hydraulic model had captured the effect on total tidal prism. The reduction was within parameters. What it had not captured was the redistribution of tidal energy within the inlet. The total volume of water was nearly the same. where that water moved and how fast, was different. She asked Wallace how long he had been running soundings at the same stations. He said, "I started in 1980. My father started in 1953. She put down her instrument. Then she said, "Do you have the original station positions written down? Not just the depth readings. The actual positions, the way your father marked them?" He said, "He marked them on the back page of the 1961 log. Same 4 stations. I've been running the same positions." She said, "For 44 years. And your father for 27 before that?" He said, "Yes." She looked at the tin box. Then she said quietly, "That's 71 years of monthly depth readings at fixed positions in an active tidal inlet. That doesn't exist anywhere in Georgia." Wallace said, "There is now." He handed her the tin box. What followed moved faster than Wallace had expected, and slower than he had hoped. Dr. Vasquez filed a formal technical comment with the Georgia Transportation Authority documenting the tidal energy redistribution she had measured. The comment included Wallace's sounding records as an appendix. 71 years of monthly depth readings at the same 4 stations, the longest continuous inlet monitoring dataset she had encountered in 12 years of Georgia coastal research. The authority commissioned an independent review. The review firm confirmed Dr. Vasquez's findings. The bar migration was consistent with the tidal energy redistribution. The South Channel reduction was within the first-year projections for a worst-case scenario that the original model had flagged, but the engineers had judged unlikely. The South Channel reduction was the worst-case scenario. In the first year, the authority modified the landfill approach design. The eastern portion, closest to the South Channel margin, was partially removed and replaced with a low-profile open pile trestle that restored the tidal buffer on the inlet's northern edge. It was not a complete correction. The western section remained, but the open pile section allowed tidal exchange to resume to the buffer zone, and Dr. Vasquez's follow-up surveys showed the redistribution effect diminishing within 2 tidal seasons. The bar migration slowed. The South Channel depth at Wallace's mid-channel station recovered 4 to 8 inches by the following October. The mullet run that year arrived on the 4th of September. Still early, but September. The formal review report, issued the following spring, included a section on observational datasets. The authority's original hydraulic model had used 22 months of survey data, within standard practice for this class of project. The inlet system, however, had a documented behavioral record extending 71 years, which would not have been available through standard survey practice, and which, had it been incorporated into the baseline, would have identified the tidal energy redistribution risk before construction began. The report recommended that future inlet infrastructure projects in Georgia coastal systems seek out historical observational records from commercial operators working the affected waters. Wallace read the recommendation twice. He closed the report and put it in the tin box between his father's 1962 log and his own current volume. He latched the box. He went to the dock. The Altamaha was running the way it ran in late spring. Full from the rains, the color of old copper where it met the tide, carrying whatever the Piedmont had sent down through the winter. The bar was where it had been in April for as long as Wallace had been checking. Pulled back to its northern position, the South Channel open and honest. The mullet scouts wouldn't come for another 2 months. He stood at the dock's edge for a while, looking at the mouth. His father had named the boat Altamaha because he said a man ought to name his boat after the thing that fed him, not after himself. The river fed them. It was only right to say so. Wallace had kept the name because his father was right, and because some things don't need changing just because time passes. He went inside. He opened his log. He wrote down the depth at the mid-channel station. The river was running where it had always run. It had simply been waiting for someone to keep track.